College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we are commencing a series of 6 programs from a grant from the Association for the Humanities in Idaho that was provided to 6 faculty members at the University of Idaho. The theme of that grant program is Our Responsibility for Nature. These particular programs involve a fundamental premise that our relationships to nature are more complex than suggested by the oversimplified categories of public debate. We thus hope to present a rounded view of the important precepts and values underlying our environmental options. Idahoans in particular have an immediate access to some of the greatest expansion of land and wilderness in the United States and have a particular responsibility to ponder these very important issues. In order to get these programs off to a very good start, we are happy to welcome to our program Dr. William Greaver, who serves as the chairman of the Department of History at the University of Idaho. Dr. Greaver holds a BA degree from Pomona College with honors in history and master's and PhD degrees from Harvard University. He is the author of 2 books, the first entitled Arid Domain, the Santa Fe Railway and its Western Land Grant. The second book is entitled The Bonanza West, the Story of the Western Mining Rushes, 1848 to 1900. For our program this evening, his topic will be Early Americans and Their Environment, and he'll be questioned by our panel. Dr. Greaver, welcome to our program.
I'm glad to be here.
Joining with me in questioning our guest on this very important topic is 2 of our regular panelists and 1 visiting member. First of all is Mary Lou Reed, who is chairman of the Association for the Humanities in Idaho and has provided this grant to the University of Idaho. Lou, thank you for your association and what you've done.
Thank you, Tony, for talking so well about the Association for the Humanities. We appreciate the plug.
And Sherry Boswell is a graduate of Princeton University and is a member of the faculty teaching history at North Idaho College. Welcome, Sherry.
Thank you, Tony.
And a regular panelist, Janelle Berg. Welcome once again, Janelle.
It's nice to be here, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once from Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Greaver, there is a thread that runs through the speech that you are giving that perhaps the American pioneers had no understanding of the limits of the land, timber, and mineral resources or their need to take care of them. And is this true?
Yes, it's true. They were concerned with immediate problems, how to make a living, how to wrest a fortune from the soil if they could. Most of their work was hard physical labor. They had very little time for thought and reflection. They would have laughed, most of them, if anybody had told them we would ever run short of natural resources.
Did you feel that they established sort of a development ethic that we're still dealing with today?
A development ethic, I would say that they tried to develop each area, if that's what you mean, to secure the maximum profit. They were not concerned with what happened in the future. They were concerned with today, how much money they could get from the immediate area at the immediate time with no particular regard to the future. Everybody thought this way, so that it wasn't just the pioneers who were actually doing it, who were doing something that the rest of the country might disapprove. Everybody thought it was okay.
Well, was there sort of a moral or religious backing for that kind of position?
Only to the extent that some of them were of Puritan background in the Atlantic frontier or were from New England, which of course had a Puritan ethic of hard work as sort of a religious necessity. But actually, most of the pioneers had to work hard. If you didn't work hard, you didn't make it. You failed and you had to go back to the civilized areas again.
So they were just grubbing along.
Yes, it meant lots of grubbing. And of course, certain types enjoyed it very much. Pioneer axemen enjoyed clearing the forests in the eastern part of the country. They could clear about 12 acres a year. And they enjoyed it so much that some of them, after they got the land cleared, really didn't care to stay and farm. They preferred to move somewhere else and cut some more trees. They felt hemmed in if they had neighbors.
Sherry Boswell.
Thank you. You also mentioned in your speech that the earliest Americans also learned Indian techniques to master the wilderness, and particularly to master the fur trade. I was wondering, first of all, if these traders were, as you say, more red men than white in some instances, why don't we see the Native Americans' viewpoints on the environment adopted by these white men?
Well, I think in the first place that they were, again, primarily interested in making profits. One way to make profits was to learn something about the red man's life in order to get along with them better, so that they were not concerned, for example, with what the red man's religious views might be. They weren't concerned with an area which might be held sacred to the red man because of their religion. They were concerned instead with simply learning enough to get along. Those who became more like red men than white were those who stayed in the trade a lifetime. In some instances, they almost reverted to being what you might call savages, rather than having much sign of the civilization in which they were born.
But much of scholarship today, I think, leads us to believe that perhaps in some ways the American native was the first ecologist, or at least a very early conservator of natural resources. Why wouldn't some of that rub off on the colonists?
I think it was because the whites were not interested in learning this Indian viewpoint. They were interested in obtaining, as fur traders, a maximum number of pelts in order to make immediate profits. They were not concerned, for example, with conserving the animals. They were perfectly willing to encourage Indians to overharvest so that the animals could not reproduce themselves but would decline in number. They were perfectly willing to urge the Indians to take the pelts at the wrong time of the year. Pelts were best in the wintertime when obviously there was lots of fur. If you took them in the summer, they were inferior and would buy a low price on the European market. But the majority of fur traders were perfectly willing to do this. The fur traders simply had no part of the Indian viewpoint on ecology.
Janelle Burke.
To further set the stage, we have been talking, except for the fur trade, in large part about colonial America.
Yes.
And to further set the stage, can you give us some idea about the size of towns and how large they were, and put that kind of perspective in our viewpoint?
The towns were quite small and did not occupy very many people. That is to say, 96% of the American people at the time of the American Revolution lived in a rural or farm situation, and only 4% lived in towns. The towns were relatively small. I can't give precise statistics, but I would think that New York, perhaps, and Philadelphia were the largest, with maybe 30,000 people or somewhere around that. And in the South, the only major city was Charleston, which had about 10,000 population at the time of the Revolution.
In your speech, you talk about shipbuilding, and you talk about ships being built in towns that were about the size of Orofino or Troy in Idaho. Can you enlarge upon that?
This is true, particularly in Maine, where there were exceptionally good forests. They could build ships there for one-half the cost of building them in England. So, of course, English ship owners as well as colonial ship owners used them. Also, from these small towns, many of these ships went out into the international trade, went to Europe, Africa, and the West Indies, and came back with their goods to these small towns, giving the small towns an international outlook in the 1600s and 1700s that they would lose later on when the trade shifted to the major ports and no longer went to the smaller cities.
Lou Reed.
Well, you have stressed that the early settlers had no leisure time and that they had no time for planning. And my question to you is, what can history, or has history shown to us or told us about the value of planning? How essential is planning now at this point when we have finally recognized the limits of our resources?
Well, there was always some planning to some extent in New England. In the very early days when they established new communities on what was then the frontier, they carefully planned them in advance. In part, this was because of religion, and in part because they wanted compact settlements. And the tradition of advanced planning remained after the practice in New England ceased, so that sometimes people went out in a group from, say, New England to Ohio or Indiana. In general, the Southerners did not plan in advance until it was forced upon them. I would say that the advantages of planning in advance were not really obvious to the majority of American people until 1900, probably.
Well, do you think we're going about our planning process intelligently now? Have we learned from history?
Yes, I think we have learned that the resources of our planet are limited, and we have learned that advanced planning pays off. The success of the United States Forest Service, which was established about 1900, is an example of successful advanced planning. So is the establishment of our national parks and how we have preserved them. There has been particular emphasis upon advanced planning, it seems to me, since the Second World War. But there was also some in the 20s and 30s, but not nearly as much as we have now.
Dr. Greaver, in your speech that you're giving at the public meetings concerning this grant that's been given on our responsibility for nature, you have indicated in that address that history has taught us in this country that what we've done to our environment comes under several headings. You mentioned agriculture and fur trade and lumber and fishing and mining. Would you take a few minutes for our audience to give them this historical background, what we've done positive or negative in relation to those? What's it done to our environment in these particular fields that you mentioned?
So far as agriculture is concerned, for a long time we simply aimed to get as much yield as possible and as much money as possible. It was not really until the 1890s that we first realized we should plan in advance, because we were interested in farming areas that were dry, that were west of the 20-inch rainfall line, and therefore new farming methods, dry farming methods, had to be devised. The next real obvious need for planning in agriculture became apparent in the 1920s because we produced much more than we could sell. However, planning to take care of the surplus, to reduce the surplus, and to have more efficient methods really did not come in until the 1930s. And this planning has continued pretty much since that time in agriculture. So far as mining is concerned, again, at first there was maximum exploitation with little thought of the future. Beginning about 1900, we realized that there were mine dumps which still contained a lot of valuable ore if we could rework them. And this was the beginning of more careful methods in mining, which have continued down to the present time. And it is profitable oftentimes to mine now where you have only 1 or 2% of ore, and the rest of it is surplus debris. In the field of forestry, scientific forestry really did not begin until about 1900 in this country. First with the preservation of federal forests. And while the idea of tree farming was around in the early 1900s, it really was not until the 1930s that the concept of tree farming got going.
From all these examples you have given, is it your experience in studying history that as we moved west, once that land had been explored and we'd reached the Pacific Ocean, that the concern increased to have some conservation? In other words, as long as there was land or animals or fish or whatever, west, that you just moved on. But then once you could not do that, you became more concerned.
That's correct. In the 1880s and early 1890s, the last of the good land that could be homesteaded was taken up. And the Americans became quite aware of this because of the publicity from various Westerners who talked about the last best West. And then, as I say, about 1904, under President Theodore Roosevelt, Americans first became conscious of the need for conservation because Theodore Roosevelt strongly backed the idea of national forests. Aided by the forester Gifford Pinchot, the two of them made an admirable publicity bureau for the cause of conservation. And the ordinary average American first became aware of the fact that you might have to conserve something of nature as a result of this campaign in regard to forestry. And later on, the idea was transferred over to other fields.
For those viewers who have joined our program in progress, our guest today is Dr. William Greaver, the chairman of the Department of History at the University of Idaho. He is in our city to give his speech on early Americans and their environment from a grant from the Association for the Humanities in Idaho under the theme, Our Responsibility for Nature. we're happy to have this opportunity to interview him. We shall continue the questioning with Sharon Boswell.
Yes. Dr. Greaver, you're mentioning planning and the fact that in the most recent decades we were beginning to look toward more planning. But I wonder, your thesis seems to be in your talk that the key to at least past use of the environment has been exploitation, to conquer, to make a quick profit. And what I was wondering is if really has that idea changed that much today? Are we not still, in fact, exploiting our resources? And are we not still, in fact, trying to conquer our environment? And perhaps, although maybe planning ahead, still using those environments, those resources to a limited end?
Well, we'll always have the profit motive. I don't think that you can eliminate it, nor do I think it is desirable to eliminate it, since we don't believe in living in a socialist type of society. You'll always have the profit motive. You will always have some men who are unenlightened and selfish. You will always have some men who are more advanced and more liberal, and they're generous in their point of view. But also I think that it can be demonstrated now that many of these methods pay off financially, that a person who follows conservation methods will make more money in the short run. He may not make it in the long run, but he'll make it he may not make it in the short run, but he'll make it in the long run. And therefore, I think that we have made considerable progress, and that taking the country as a whole, there is much more conservation that's practiced in the 70s and even in the 60s, and certainly vastly more than was practiced in the 1930s. It is sort of like the problem of the rights of the black people. We still have lots of problems, but if you compare where we are now with where we were at the time of the Second World War, we have made tremendous progress. And I think the same thing is true of conservation.
Janelle Berg.
In your speech, you talk about the pendulum swinging with the production of oil. Would you care to share with our audience how the production of oil has gone from overproduction to now a shortage?
Well, we had serious overproduction before the First World War, simply because there was not very much consumption of oil, and there was much more discovered than could be marketed profitably. So there was overproduction. During the First World War itself, since the government took a strong hand in everything, they first forced conservation measures. After the war was over, the political atmosphere of that era was different than now, and the people in the federal government genuinely did not think it was a proper function, a legitimate function of government, to limit the production of any natural resource. So they asked the petroleum companies if they would please be gentlemen and conserve. The answer was they wouldn't. That is about as far as it got, except in the states of Texas and Oklahoma, where the two states forced conservation. Otherwise, there was a lot of talk and little action until we came to the Second World War, when, of course, petroleum, along with a lot of other things, was rationing. And after the war was over, there was no problem. We really did not think again of an oil shortage as an American people until the mid-1970s. Some of the experts may have seen it coming earlier, but certainly the average American did not. And there was nothing about from the publicity of the petroleum companies that would lead you to suppose it might happen.
What lesson do you think this teaches us in terms of a product that is plentiful now? Should we be learning something about our use of products that appear to us to be in endless supply?
Well, I suppose what we should learn first is really how much we have, which is perhaps easier said than done, and keep an eye on an increasing use of those products to see if we were coming to the high point of use in comparison with what was available. I suppose there are other products, but you never hear people talk about them. If there is an imminent shortage of something else that's really vital as oil coming up, certainly it is one of the great American secrets so far.
Lou Reed.
From an early time, the family farm was based primarily around the concept of 160 acres, and this was transferred after the early Homestead Act into lands that were receiving Bureau of Reclamation water. What do you think of the legislation currently around which would change that to a much larger acreage. How do you feel about the plans to change?
Well,
that concept?
this is a controversial measure, and I think applies primarily to irrigated lands in California, where there was, by law, a limit that no person could own on their over 160 acres. The law was widely disregarded. It is now held in much larger units. And the question is whether it should be broken down into the small units again. The argument for it primarily is that everybody should have a chance to have a small farm and be make moderate profits. The argument against it is that large landholders and large corporations can do it much more efficiently, and that the real future in America is the larger farm, that everywhere, not just in irrigated land, the family farm is likely to disappear. Obviously, this is a hot issue. I think that it would be very difficult to take land away from people in the California area who have such large amounts. I am reminded of what J.P. Morgan once said in regard to a proposal during Roosevelt's administration to break up one of the large trusts. He said, "Who can unscramble scrambled eggs?" And I think that somewhat that applies here.
Do you think we're just being nostalgic when we seem to value the family farm as much as we do, especially in Idaho?
Well, I don't think,
realistic?
I think it has very genuine and important values. There's no doubt about that. And I think that in part the nature of the family farm has changed because now we have mechanization. And therefore we need much fewer families than we needed in 1900 or 1910 to produce the same amount of food. So that the family farm is far different now than it was when we look back to the earlier period. I hope that we can preserve the family farm in its present size, not in its earlier smaller size. I hope so, but I'm really not an economist, and historians are notorious for not being able to predict the future.
Sharon Boswell.
Going on with this idea of agriculture and also the family farm, looking back in history, remember that Thomas Jefferson his theory about America was that the backbone of America was the small farmer, the yeoman farmer as he called him, and he had a great respect for the farmer. At the same time, he felt that it was necessary for this farmer to subdue the land as opposed to having a great pride in the landscape. What I'm asking is, isn't there kind of a dichotomy there between the viewpoints of building up the image of the small farmer, but at the same time having a pride in the landscape and having that farmer subdue the landscape and change the landscape?
Well, so far as Jefferson is concerned, it's true that in his earlier years he hoped that America would only be a nation of farmers. But in old age he came to realize that that would not be, and he was perfectly agreeable to recognizing commerce and manufacturing as being important for our country as well as farming. So far as a love of the soil is concerned, it seems to me that this is bred into many farmers, but what looks beautiful to a farmer might not look beautiful to a historian. That is to say, a perfectly level field in Iowa with growing crops on it would look wonderful to many farmers because of that they would think of the fertility, because they could think of the ease of cultivation, because they would think of the many people who could have food and live because of what could be produced on that land. But if I looked at it, I would say it was flat and level, and I wish I was back in Idaho where I could look at some mountains.
Janelle Berg.
In your speech, you indicate that land speculation has always been with us. Right now is a time when, perhaps as Idahoans, we're particularly interested in land speculation and what's going on around us. Would you care to share with us, please, some of the things that you talk about in the speech with regard to land speculation?
Land speculation was very common in America, and it was quite profitable if you worked it right. The general idea was that you bought land on the frontier cheap and held on to it for a while. The pressure of people moving westward increased the value of the land. So all you had to do was to hold on to it for a while, and then you could sell it at a profit. That's the theory. It was sometimes a lot more difficult to do it in practice because you might have difficulty paying all the installments on your land, or it might take longer to sell than you had figured. but over the long pull, if you didn't have bad luck, you ought to be able to make good money out of it. And therefore, both people with a lot of money and people with a little money and everybody in between was engaged in land speculation. It certainly was one of the great outdoor sports in America for over 200 years. Now, of course, there is still speculation in land, but primarily, it seems to me, it's land at the edge of cities, hoping that the city or town will grow and that the land you purchased as farmland could be sold as city land at a much higher price per acre.
Something else that you've indicated in your speech about our country is that in the 1700s, the visitors from Europe indicated that they were complaining about our dirty appearances in our cities. In commenting on that, how does that relate to today and how we compare with other cities around the world and what visitors are saying? Has there been a significant change in how we compare with other cities?
Well, I think that it must have been quite bad in the 1700s, for it is notorious that conditions were bad in Europe. And if the Europeans were shocked at what they saw in America, particularly the amount of junk that was piled around homes, I think it must have been quite bad. So far as now is concerned, it seems to me that big cities in America and big cities in Europe are pretty comparable as to the amount of cleanliness that they have. I think that if you go in some parts of the world, you still would find the kind of conditions that Europeans complained about in America in the 1700s.
Lou Reed.
We have just a short time left, and perhaps in that time you could say a little bit about how you feel as an historian about what you see modern man and modern woman's responsibility towards nature to be.
Well, it seems to me that we have a somewhat changed point of view. Well, there have always been people who have enjoyed nature, and they will still be, but we realize that we have a responsibility to preserve this for future generations, a responsibility that most Americans were not aware of earlier. And this involves many more complications than Americans of even 25 years ago were aware of. I would say now that any thoughtful American who had any interest in the subject could easily see at least what the basics ought to be, whether or not we achieve them or not.
I must interrupt. I'm sorry we're out of time. Dr. Greaver, it's been a pleasure having you with us.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks the panel very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us in the weeks ahead when again we shall be dealing with our responsibility for nature on some other programs. Our next guest in this series will be Cliff Thompson, the Dean of the Law School at the University of Idaho, speaking on environment and law. And that will be in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I hope you'll be with us when we bring that program. In the meantime, next week we will deal with another subject, and I hope you will be with us then. Have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a